Welcome to the next generation in chelated minerals. Introducing new Keysure Plus amino acid chelated minerals from Balchem. Keysure Plus delivers a higher concentration of mineral with a superior amino acid profile. The higher mineral content adds formulation flexibility, opening up space in the ration, and also reduces the carbon footprint. The superior amino acid profile delivers 28% protein from microbial biomass. The Keysure Plus line also offers a granulated form for improved handling characteristics and reduced dust. Visit balchem.com to see how new Keysure Plus can deliver the added benefits you need to improve performance and reduce manufacturing hurdles.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing here at Balchem. Today, we welcome Dr. Mary Beth Hall from the Cows Are Always Right, LLC, to help us figure out what's going on between the cows and their rations, and we're going to do that by looking at their manure. Dr. Hall is the owner of the Cows Are Always Right dairy consulting business, where she counsels with producers to improve feeding and profitability. She was formerly with the USDA and at the Dairy Forage Research Center, Wisconsin. She was there for about 2 decades. She holds a PhD from Cornell University in animal science, and she now resides in rural Wisconsin with her husband, and I hear also with a pack of dogs, and we may have to talk about that, Mary Beth. Mary Beth, this is not your first time to the lecture, and you've wandered into the Real Science Exchange Pub a couple times, so welcome back. It's good to have you here again. I must say we've had a lot of people across our stage, and you're one of my favorites. Before we get started, I want you to talk a little bit about the name of your company. The Cows Are Always Right. How'd you come up with that?
Well, first things first, Scott, it's a pleasure to be back on the Real Science Exchange. And for the record, despite the fact this used to be a sort of pub deal, this contains water at the moment. The cows are always right. Why on earth would I name an LLC that? After working in extension as a county agent way back when I started in the industry, and then working in extension and research as faculty at the University of Florida, one of the things I figured out was that when you walk a herd, when you're trying to understand what's going on, don't assume that you know. You've got to look at the cows, because they are going to tell you exactly what's going on. So even with people's best efforts, the cows are the ones that are always right. And if we got to the point where we were suggesting that they weren't, we had to rethink what was going on. It's the one thing I'm sure of, whether it was research, extension, or trying to help farmers do a better job with their herds.
Yeah, excellent. So you were with USDA. Now you've got your own shingle out. Tell people how they can get a hold of you.
Okay. On the first slide that we have, you can get a hold of me. Easiest thing is by my email address. It's mbhall at tcaar.com. The cows are always right.com.
Excellent.
Glad to hear from folks.
Yeah, good. Well, looking forward to your presentations. Please proceed.
Will do. Thank you. Okay, so again, Scott and Balchem, thank you very much for having me here today for this presentation. And yes, the title is Manure Evaluation, figuring out what's going on between cows and their rations. And when we think about what we're looking at in life or on farms, normal, put that in quotes, is what we get used to. But in truth, we got to figure out whether normal, what we've gotten used to, is what we really want, or if there are things we can look at that might give us hints about how we can improve on the situation. And especially when we're walking farms, our goal is to get enough information in context from enough different angles to make sense of the situation. And so, all right, evaluating a herd, what we're accustomed to doing, we look at the cows, their body condition score, their coats, their lameness scores, whether or not they're ruminating to the degree we think they should. We look at the feed. Is it moldy? Is it dusty? Do we have analyses on it? Is it consistent or is it variable over time for what the cows get? Is it well mixed? And I say existence, that goes to the feed bunk. Is there feed there in front of the cows, or are they going part of the day without anything to try and eat? We look at the bunks. Is it moldy? Is it clean? Is it fresh? Is it heating? Is it mixed? Is there way back? We look at the water. Is it clean? Is it fresh? And is it available for the animals? I've seen enough water tanks that look like they had their own ecosystems going, and that's not high on the list. The facilities, are they comfortable? Are they clean? Are they ventilated? The employees, how are they interacting with the cows and the cows with them? And then finally, we have manure. We evaluate this too because no, manure does not just happen. There's a lot of things going on between the biology of the cow and her diet that decides how this stuff turns out. So, in context, manure gives insights to the interaction between the cow and the diet. And again, remember, the cows are always right. So, this is one more thing to look at. Now, manure starts in the diet. So, we're going to start back at the diet. Physically effective fiber is actually really important for how manure ends up looking. Uh, it increases rumen function, it increases rumination, it affects rumen retention and passage, and it reduces the risk of digestive upset. Essentially, physically effective fiber can allow the rations to work. And when we're looking at physically effective fiber, we want material that's coarse enough to keep the animal chewing, but not so coarse that they can sort. And so when you look at the feeds that we have where you might get effective fiber, typically the physical form is going to be best for effective fiber when we're looking at any of our forages. Like here I have alfalfa silage, corn silage, and wheat straw. And when you compare the particle sizes with those to our byproducts, even sugar beet pulp or ground corn, the lower pictures there, all of those materials are really finely ground, all told. Even if they're high in fiber, the NDF, the fiber, can dilute the amount of other components in the diet, but it's not going to give the physical form that would get cows to chew and would affect some of the rumen function. I mean, so you take a look at physical form in the rumen, and the rumen is where we start off to, after the feed in what manure is going to look like. The larger the forage particles are, they can make a mat that holds feeds in the rumen. And gradually, through rumination, and mostly rumination, but also microbial digestion, those particles get broken down until they're of a size that they can pass readily out of the rumen. Now, those bigger particles can allow along this mat that can hold particles in the rumen can allow them to be retained there longer so that they can be more extensively fermented. That gets us microbial protein, organic acids, and such. The time they spend in the rumen also affects how small those particles become, because that's the period of time that they would be subject to rumination and that type of particle breakdown. So when you look at the rumen, that ends up determining what gets out of the rumen undigested and passes through the rest of the gut, and what particle size goes from the diet to potential breakdown to passing out and goes to the rest of the gut. I mean, so where we start out is with rumen fermentation. We've got, for where feed digests, in the rumen, protein and carbohydrates have the potential to be digested. When feed passes to the small intestine, only true protein from the feed or from microbes can be digested there, starch, but not fiber, and also fats, lipids. Once things get past the small intestine, they'll go to the cecum and large intestine where we run into a fermentation again. It's like the fermentation that goes on in the rumen, but it's not so well buffered. And there, again, the microbes in that hindgut can digest protein and carbohydrates to some extent. And where different materials get digested in the gut, the site of their digestion affects what manure looks like. So you take a look at the two compartments for fermentation, the rumen and the cecum and large intestine. And what we see, and let's see, I'll get a laser pointer here. Okay. When we have organic acids produced by the microbes by fermenting carbohydrates, particular, in the rumen, they can be absorbed. In the hindgut, they can also be absorbed out of the gut, and they'll provide energy to the cow. When we look at microbial protein production, when it's produced in the rumen, those bugs can die and recycle there, or they can pass down to the abomasum and then to the small intestine and be digested and absorbed, and the cow gets microbial protein from that. If that microbial protein, the microbes, are grown up and produced in the hindgut, they end up out in the feces. They no nutritional value to the cow. Gases that are produced, carbon dioxide and methane, happen both in the rumen and the hindgut from fermentation. And if they're produced in the rumen, she either belches them out, eructation, or she bloats if they're not released. When they're produced in the hindgut, they end up going out with the feces. Okay, so depending where that fermentation happens, it affects what nutrients the cow gets and also affects what the manure looks like. A shift in the site of digestion from the rumen the to the large intestine and cecum changes the nutrient supply and causes some of the symptoms of ruminal acidosis and digestive upset. If things aren't being fermented in the rumen like they should, and they're being fermented here, that's where we get some of these signs that we look at that say we got a problem. So now we're going to go through a whole series of slides looking at just what manure looks like. Again, it doesn't just happen. So here we start with the good stuff for a lactating herd. It's soft, but it forms up. And Mike Hutchins used to talk about these as double dippers. They're not too loose, they're not too firm, and things, at least on the surface, look pretty well digested. But here we get into some of the stuff that's not normal. It's when you get this foamy material that you can see it's full of air bubbles. This goes back to excess fermentation in the hindgut that created acid and gas. And sometimes it comes out just about looking like shaving cream. This is not normal. The feed didn't digest. It's an indicator that a goodly portion of fermentable feed didn't ferment, didn't digest where it should have. Diarrhea, not normal. That's when we have this really loose material that comes out and just splatters. It can be a sign of ruminal acidosis or digestive upset. Things didn't ferment well in the front end of the gut. They fermented extensively in the hindgut, and you got this. You can also get it if animals are eating spoiled feed. Um, and also it can be caused by disease. Think winter dysentery. Spoiled feed. Once upon a time, when I was at University of Florida on faculty and running a research trial out at the farm, the herd manager came up to me and said, "Dr. Hall, did you formulate the diets to reduce milk production?" And I told him, "No, I hadn't done that on purpose." And so I went out and I walked the cows. And what I was finding is there was manure in that pen of cows that were on Kaylin Gates. Manure looked perfectly fine. Then other manure that was just loose diarrhea. And then I went to the front of the bunk and I saw these clumps of spoilage there. And then I went and I looked at our bunk silo, and what had happened was that we were towards the back end of a drive over pile of silage, and some of the spoilage hadn't been cleaned off. And I figured odds were whatever cow drew the short straw and ate this was the one that was getting sick. And so when they cleaned off the bunk silo to get rid of the spoilage, all of a sudden the cows came up in milk. We weren't seeing diarrhea, and I looked like a much better nutritionist. Undigested feed that's in the manure is also not normal because eaten doesn't mean digested. Um, and so when you start seeing chunks of corn like this coming through, go back and take a look at how finely ground the corn grain is. It's these sort of pieces on the larger particles that are being held on the screens that usually come out here. And then you have to figure out, did it come from the corn grain, which you can get ground more finely, dryish, high moisture corn that might need to be ground more finely, or was the corn not properly processed in the corn silage and it was on the dry side? That last one you're going to have a problem with going through the rest of the year, unless maybe you make sure your physically effective fiber is adequate to hold it in the rumen to be better digested. I mean, that's the other thing. It's the grind here, and it's also the total rumen function. Was the feed held in place long enough so that it could be digested? Now, another thing that has come up here with seeing large particles in the manure, undigested feed, is when animals slug feed. If there's overcrowding at the bunk, if animals are eating most of their feed as quickly as they can because they're afraid that they will not be able to get more later, perhaps, with slug feeding, you can get more material passing through as well. Okay, also not normal is obviously undigested. I mean, you're not supposed to be able to identify feed that's in the manure. I've seen whole linted cottonseed in manure with the lint still on it. Citrus pulp, we'll get into civic manure that was still orange coming through. And here you can see a sheath from a piece of corn silage. This is a piece of grass that cow nibbled that came through green. I mean, and here's another piece of silage. Um, if you're dealing with something like sorghum, you might expect to see little BBs coming through the seeds undigested. That is normal. Um, with very high producing cows who are eating a lot of feed, you might get the occasional particle of corn silage stalk or alfalfa stem coming through. But to see things like this, you want to make sure you've done what you can to avoid this because this feed didn't make had even have the chance to make milk. It only had the chance to make manure. More not normals. You get this pasty, clumpy material that just not right, splattered like this, kind of like diarrhea, but in an occasional spot, or in the herd, if it's way too dry and clumping like this, and you can see that there's grain that came through, um, not normal for a lactating cow. And I'd say the pasty and the splatter, not normal for anything. Also not normal is when you have a group of cows that are supposed to be getting the same diet. Their manure should pretty much all look relatively alike, except maybe for 5% of the cows eating the same diet should have similar manure. And if they're not, are they sorting their feed? If they're overcrowded and slug feeding, is that affecting things? You have to go look and figure it out. Or not normal, mucin cast. When I first saw these, I wasn't quite sure where they were coming from. It but they are coming out in the feces. They are not mucus per se that you'd think was be coming out of the vagina. Um, if you pick these up and you rinse them off in some water, they end up looking like sausage casings. They're a sign of past damage in the large intestine, and they can be brown, gray, or almost black. They can be really long pieces, or they can be in shreds. And I tell you what, one way that you can take a look for these when you're walking a herd is if you drag the toe of your boot across a manure pile and something moves after your toe goes by, it's probably one of these. If it's not, back away from the manure pile fairly quickly because Lord knows what it is. Um, but okay, focusing on what kind of damage we're talking about. This is some work that was done by Henriksen et al. And this is the lining of the large intestine. This is normal, where the cells migrate up and they gradually end up sloughing off. When you have excessive fermentation in the hindgut, and potentially these can also come from toxins, lipopolysaccharides. What you have is the top layer of the epithelium, the cell covering of the intestine gets destroyed. And it's at this point that the animal oozes or secretes mucin out to cover that. And then then that mucin cast gets shed some days later. Have never yet been able to find out when does the damage occur versus when we see the mucin cast, but it indicates probably that you have too much hindgut fermentation and possibility of endotoxins. Okay, another thing that's not normal, the mucin casts are really pretty easy to destroy, but fibrin casts are tough. Um, they're a lot tougher in texture and they're rarer. The only time I've seen them is when a cow was eating moldy cottonseed hulls and got quite the dose of them. Um, it's still a sign of past damage to the large intestine. Okay, now we're going to get into manure screening, and this is something got into down at University of Florida. Here we had cups to be able to collect samples, gloves, um, Sharpie marker to label the cups where they came from, a kitchen sieve with 1/16 or 1.6 millimeter openings. It's about 8 inches, or let's see, maybe about 16 centimeters, 16 to 20 centimeters across. And with these kitchen screens, if you take it out of your kitchen, don't put it back. For collecting samples in a pinch, you can use a red beer cup and just put a glove over the top so it doesn't tip over as you're carrying it, or you don't worry about it. To look at particle size, what you end up doing is you rinse your manure sample into that kitchen sieve. And then you end up wiping your hand around the inside as you're rinsing the material through. This keeps the sieve from plugging. And what is coming out the bottom are the microbes that are in there, any particles that are really, really fine that can pass through the sieve. And this can include quite a bit of fiber as well. And that is normal. So what you've got when you're finished are cleaned up particles so that you can see what actually came through in the manure. And by the way, for differences in the amount of solids you get out of a given amount of manure, the differences in the amount of solids in a set volume of manure reflects differences in the amount of gas or liquid in the manure and how much passes the screen. And the easiest way to end up cleaning off one of these screens is just to flip it backwards and rinse it off. For whatever you do, do not let it dry or it'll be miserable to get clean again. So this is the kind of thing you can see when you rinse out the feces through a screen. These two sets of manure came out of like the first 30-day fresh group in a herd that I was walking. This on your left is fecal particles that came out of a really good looking pile of manure. It looked normal for a lactating cow. And when you see and by the way, this was on a ryegrass silage diet that the animals had been on. Both of these cows were on the same TMR. These really fine particles coming through would suggest good ruminal retention and better digestion and better rumination. So you got the particles that fine. When you take a look at this bad sample showed up in a pile of bubbly diarrhea. Okay, it was liquid, and you see how large these particles are. Something is wrong. They weren't retained in the rumen long enough to get digested and ruminated, and this is not good. This is a sick cow that You got to figure out what's going on. When you look at, and by the way, the penny is here. That did not come through the cow. That's just for an idea of particle size relative to everything else. Here's feces from a diet that was really on the short side in roughage, in physically effective form. It only had about 19% corn silage, 5.5% cottonseed hulls, and 9% alfalfa hay. And you see there's all sorts of coarse particles in here, and even whole cottonseed that came through with the lint still on. I don't mind seeing whole cottonseed come through black with the lint digested off of it, but if it came through like this, it means it wasn't held in the room long enough. You don't want to see lots of particles in the manure that are bigger than a half inch or about 2 centimeters long. Okay, this, again, really coarse material coming through, more undigested feed, and it was found in a pool of bubbly diarrhea. And what blew me away is this piece here. This piece of grass hay that came through intact. That's a sick cow, and we got to figure out how to fix what's going on in her rumen. Okay, before corn processors were popular, we were seeing this. Now, corn grain that isn't ground at all is really kind of smooth and can slide through. But here you can also see a corn silage leaf that came through still green. You weren't getting the ruminal retention, and you weren't getting the nutritional value out of these feeds that the cow needed to make milk and just to support herself. And in this case, I mean, this was coming from the silage, so there was no repairing it that year. Um, we ended up getting an increase in milk production when we added ground corn to the ration to make up for the starch that was not being digested in the corn grain coming through. Okay, so as we're walking the cows, to look at manure, you get an idea of the variation. Okay, you don't just pick out the good stuff or the bad stuff. You go into the groups and you take 3 or 4 samples and bring it back for screening and evaluate what's going on in the whole herd. You look between groups and between rations. So 4 to 6 pies per group for particle size. And remember, about 5% of the manure will not look like the rest. And one thing you'll notice from this picture, this particular cow here who was walking away was practicing her cursive writing skills. All right. Um, that's not exactly what you want to see either. But again, any of this is going to need context. Manure probably varies somewhat over 24 hours, and there's no way to know exactly the amount produced to precisely quantify what you sampled. Um, when you're looking at manure, just remember it's manure. It's not rocket science. It's qualitative, and to my take, it's qualitative. And what you end up needing to do is looking at what's there, looking at the cows, and going back and understanding what might be going on in the gut that would give you these kind of results. So walking the herd and getting context, just remember the cows have very few hobbies. And so if they're given the opportunity, they're going to sort their feed. If you look in the feed bunk and you see holes that cows have dug like this, refer to them as cow holes, you'll watch animals put their nose down, move it back and forth, and then dive to the bottom. And they're typically sorting their feed for grain because the grain is going to be most dense and drop to the bottom. So what you need is a moist enough diet to try and hold that together. And also don't give them really long pieces of forage because they can readily sort those out. Now, Dr. Lou Armentano from University of Wisconsin came up with the notion that if a piece of forage is longer than a cow's mouth is wide, she can sort it. So that also means, mind you, that heifers can probably do a better job of sorting than mature cows can. So what you want is to cut these large particles down to maybe 1 to 2 inches long. So maybe 2 to 5 centimeters long and mixed in a moist diet to get the cows to eat it. You also need to make sure the diet is properly mixed. In this case, the cows were being helped in their sorting by the alfalfa hay not being properly mixed with the rest of the TMR in this partially mixed ration. So this cow was eating the alfalfa hay, and this cow was eating the rest of the TMR, not what the diet looked like on paper. You also take a look, see, because cows will eat more dirt, salt, or bicarb when they have digestive upset. I don't think it's necessarily anything specific they're after, or I haven't been able to figure that out, but it means something's not right. Um, this area with sand in it was in front of the stalls over in this one barn I was working with. And at the end of heat stress, the cows had eaten this down by about 1.5 feet. Something was not right in the diet or in their environment, and needed some attention. When you're walking the cows, when you see, okay, okay, granted, these cows are dirty, okay? Please just move on from that. But you usually expect cows to just be standing with their tail hanging naturally. If you walk through a herd and you see them holding up their tails like this for an extended period after they've defecated, not that it doesn't go back down fairly quickly, you're probably looking at either uterine infections or gut irritation that's keeping them holding the tail up, and that's one more thing to consider. Heat stress. Going from New York State down to Florida taught me a lot about heat stress. In New York State, at least historically, heat stress has been more theoretical than something that was anything close to being dealt with in a subtropical or tropical environment. Heat stress, here I'm saying it causes digestive upset. Let me just say it participates in digestive upset. You have cows panting and decreasing the amount they're ruminating. They're drooling away bicarb and saliva that should go to buffering their rumen. They tend to slug feed, and I have never seen cows sort their feed harder than animals that are heat stressed. Best thing you can do here, besides making sure you have a balanced diet that has adequate effective fiber and possibly less starch in it and adequate and more than adequate NBF, um, is cool the cows. That is really the only way to handle heat stress. So, wrapping this up, when you're on the farm, you look at the manure, but you got to put everything in context. You have to look at everything and bring it all together so you have a context. The manure appearance, fecal particle size, undigested feed in the manure, percent rumination, eating behavior, sorting or not, slug feeding or not. Look at the animal health, which includes hooves, their production, their feed efficiency, their environment. Are they comfortable? Can they lay down and rest? Are they heat stressed or not? And looking at the overall management of the feed of the herd. And you use these together to build a case as to what ration or management changes are needed. It needs to be brought all together to give you an answer that can lead you to understanding what the cows are telling you, because the cows are always right. And so with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you, Mary Beth. Before we get started, though, with our Q&A portion, we'd like to share a brief video. Then we'll be right back to answer the questions you've submitted during today's presentation. Balchem has invested decades perfecting the art of nutrient encapsulation. And now, new AminoShure XL is setting a new standard, delivering 35% more metabolizable lysine than leading competitors. With AminoShure XL, you can provide your cows with a more consistent and higher quality source of metabolizable lysine, leading to improved and more dependable results. A recent meta-analysis found that feeding rumen-protected lysine led to an increase in milk fat percentage and 4.4 more pounds of energy-corrected milk. Feed new AminoShure XL to your cows and have confidence that you're using the most consistent, reliable, and cost-effective source of lysine on the market today. Learn more at balchem.com/XL. All right, as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. Dr. Hall, our first question is, let's go with, saw one here from Dr. Park. Dr. Hall, the recent focus on reducing methane emissions, can the gas space in the rumen grow and force the liquid and solid fractions to be reduced?
That is a very good question. You know, what I would think, and this is okay, periodically when we go through these, I might just abbreviate something with MBBG, which is Mary Beth's Best Guess. I mean, what we've got with any of our ruminants, they're designed to belch out gases so that we don't build up pressure and get bloating in the rumen. I'm not When I've been doing rumen evacuations on cows, I've been more accustomed to seeing the gas space reduced when after an animal is eaten when the rumen is more full. I never considered that the gas could apply pressure to get things to pass as opposed to being eructated, belched out. Um, doesn't say it can't, but I think the cow would have another way to get rid of that gas before it created problems. But I don't have firm information on that.
All right, very well. Another question from another one of my favorites, Dr. Mike Hutchins. He'd like to know, do you measure fecal pH as a tool?
Okay. Hi, Mike. Okay. Um, yes, I have. And one of the things you get to look at with fecal pH is if you have a dry cow, your fecal pH is actually a lot higher. It might be up around 7. As you have animals that are getting more grain in their diet and that are eating more, you do have the potential for more fermentable material to pass down through the gut and be fermented in the hindgut, but that's normal. That's not when we're seeing any of these nasty things that I showed you in photos. Um, when we get to the lactating herd, you might be down into the 6s. I have possibly even if things get really severe with fermentable material going through, you might get a low pH, but alternatively, you might get a really high pH. And that's with diarrhea dumping bicarb. It's sort of like what happens with calves with diarrhea. They'll dump bicarb into the gut, and that'll pass out, and that gives you a really high pH. I mean, so you can't, yes, I have looked at pH, but in figuring out how to use it well as a diagnostic tool, have not been able to get there. And again, something like diarrhea that has a more alkaline pH, it seems counterintuitive to the basis for what we think is going on.
All right, very well. I've got a question here, and I don't know, Mary Beth, if you can see the questions or not, but if you want to follow along, this one comes in from Mohammed, and I'll do my best to kind of make sure I do this justice. But it appears that he's got in some herds, high producing lactating cows sometimes have a sudden rumen upset with signs of colic, with left side bloat. Upon a rectum exam, there's no dung or sometimes a pasty type of manure, and there's a right side ping sound. Um, these cows have already been vaccinated for Clostridia, and they have 100% titer. And he's wanting to know why they have hemorrhagic bowel syndrome. So I'm assuming that they were diagnosed with that, and he's looking for your guidance.
Okay, one of the seed questions that I sent to Scott um, was how specifically can you use manure to diagnose certain conditions? Okay. And, because this question has come up before, but in terms of can you tell what mycotoxin is creating havoc through looking at manure? Your question's a damn good one. I guess what I'm looking at is that the manure evaluation gives you a general idea of what is going on. I don't know that it can tell you specifically what went sideways, and I'm not sure that I've ever seen a good association made between hemorrhagic bowel and anything we were looking at manure. Not to my knowledge. Um, the one thing that has shown up is, and I didn't cover it in my talk, periodically, and this is when there is manure and things are not looking necessarily quite right, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. You can find these masses of clay-like stuff in the feces. It can be chunks, it can be small pieces. Um, I've spent way too much time fishing through manure and trying to figure out what these things were. Because when you get them, they're like clay. There's not much of any fiber, not much of any feed in them. It's this weird material. And I was at a conference in Michigan years back talking about manure evaluation, and a couple of veterinarians came up to me afterwards and said, "We know what that is." And what they were saying is it was evolving in the abomasum and it was being shed out from there. And then a friend who's a veterinarian in Florida, Kerry McGehee, told me that um, when he was doing DAs, he would sometimes have to go to the abomasum and work this material out that was just clumpy and whatever it was in there. And all I'm thinking is if you've got problems with gut stasis, if you've got problems with gut dysfunction, and you're allowing abomasal secretions and microbial mass to build up there that eventually comes out, that might point to something in the feces that goes back to a specific part of the gut. But for the other things you describe, um, I don't know that we can get that specific in evaluating manure and making that connection, or I don't have the information to do so.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. I don't like to get too commercial in these things, but I will say, Mohammed, is that my friends at Fibro Animal Health has a product called Omnigen that has been known to work for true hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, if that is in case exactly what you do have. So you may want to contact them and see if they can help you out. Uh, Next question then comes in from Dr. Zimmerman. Dr. Hall, what are the black specks in the manure on slide 16 of your presentation?
Okay, those black specks are probably are that would have come from Florida. Odds are it was cottonseed hulls or cottonseed hulls, whether it came from whole cottonseed that got chewed up. Here, let's go back to slide 16. Uh, oops. Okay, these black particles, those are going to be from cottonseed. And those are broken up portions of the hull. The cottonseed hulls are typically about 20% lignin, so they are not very digestible. And so seeing cottonseed hulls in manure is perfectly normal. One thing about cottonseed hulls to mention is that they help. If you feed higher levels of cottonseed hulls in some diets, they can help get material to leave the rumen quicker and help push things out. And so you might start seeing more identifiable ground corn grain in the manure. But they're a kind of unique feed, and I've not seen that with other feedstuffs.
All right, very well. Next question comes in from Hussein. He's got a problem with undigested fat coming through the manure. He's feeding 100 grams of an 84% fat and 200 grams of a 99% fat. So I'm going to assume one might be a calcium soap and the other one might be a hydrogenated fatty acid product. And wondering why that might be coming through in the manure. And is there anything that we can learn about how it's being digested.
Okay, well, what I'd ask you to do is can you translate that back to what percent of the diet is coming through as fat is one thing. And I think Dr. Zimmerman was also kind of weighing in with an answer with that. Um, Normally, when we're feeding cattle, we look at maybe 3% unprotected fat, another 3% protected. I mean, we have some limits to how much we're going to feed to make up for energy that we want in the diet or indigestibility and other things. And with that much fat going in, I'm ballparking it, but have you exceeded some some things we normally think of as limits for how much you put in there? I mean, the alternative is I'd throw this back to Dr. Adam Locke and say, "Hey, what is possible and what could limit that?" But Scott, from what you see, did Clay end up answering something on that?
I don't see it, but if we could bring Clay on, I'd be happy to do so.
Because it said something to the effect about he was answering.
Okay. Yep.
No, he did not answer. I just write in there that you're answering the question. Sorry.
Okay, forgive.
No worries. Clay, do you have an answer?
I don't on that one. It is a good question, is how much of it is actually coming through.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have been in herds where the manure has this kind of oily, glossy look to it. And the question was raised, all right, did that come from the fats that were fed? Um, I would go back and make sure that you haven't exceeded some limits for how much we should be feeding in the rest of the diet. I don't know what the limits are in the small intestine for being able to digest them.
Yep. All right. Very well. Fred would like to know, is it normal for cows to shed a minimum of mucin casts, or should they never be any?
Never say never. I have walked herds where I found mucin casts in one plop of manure and everything else in the herd looked fine. It's indicative that there was damage, but if we go back to the idea that maybe 5% of the cows might not be like the others or something's off kilter, um, I would prefer not to see it. It is not normal, but I don't think you can say if you found it in one spot and everything else looked fine, you got worried about it. This is why it gets really, really important to put everything in context, which also goes to, are the animals looking healthy? Are they performing well? Is their feed efficient? If you can get a dry matter intake number, is their feed efficiency good? Um, you got to put it in context and go from there.
All right. Hassan would like to know, what is the reason of a white layer on the top of some feces?
This Okay, this normally shows up after they dry, not while they're wet. And and I don't know why some of them show up white or not. It But again, I'm assuming that it's on dried material because I've not seen that on fresh feces. Um, I think it's just a function of how they dry, but I don't have anything more specific than that.
All right, thank you. Tyler is asking, what are your thoughts on seeing gelatinized starch in the manure? Is it always a bad thing? And would you say when you see it, it's a result of too much starch in the diet, not enough physical effective fiber, or both? And is there any long-lasting negative effects to the cow with having prolonged hind gut fermentation?
Yeah,
A lot of questions there.
a bunch of good questions there. Um, I mean, with gelatinized, okay, one of the things I did not hit on, when we see rumen problems in an animal, talking to the veterinary gastroenterologist, they say if a cow has ruminal acidosis, we expect her to have enteritis. Enteritis is inflammation in the small intestine. If you've got an inflamed small intestine, I mean, think about this. Starch getting past the small intestine, that's its job, is to digest starch. So you get the question, why is the small intestine failing at its job and the materials showing up in the hindgut to ferment and go out in the manure? Um, what I would go back and look at physically effective form of the diet, to retain things in the rumen, to maintain a whole variety of feeds in the rumen so they can be digested. Working in Florida with heat stress put the fear of God in me about overfeeding starch, okay, and underfeeding fiber. And so the diets that I like to run, and this is presuming decent digestibility of fiber, is running about 28 to 30% NDF, running my starch between 25 and 28%, and not trying to exceed those. If you're saying gelatinized starch, I'm taking it. This is from high moisture or well, from steam flake corn. Um, I would go walk back around the front of the cow and try and find out what's going on and look at the diet and work from there. In terms of will this, I mean, will prolonged excessive hindgut fermentation be bad for the cow? Go back to the notion that it's not normal. We don't have everything dissected down as to how long can a cow put up with this, but there's been work that with horses with laminitis that suggests once you've given an animal an insult, a nutritional insult in this case, it can set them up for other future problems to be worse. They can be resilient once, but not resilient repeatedly. And if the excessive hindgut fermentation is related back to problems in the rumen and what we've associated those with hoof problems, you've put the cow behind the 8 ball. And I guess the bottom line is get rid of the problem so her system can work properly. Um, I wouldn't, I unless there are some seriously extenuating circumstances on the farm, I wouldn't just shrug off some of these things as, they'll get over it. I don't want to. One of our biggest jobs with cattle is getting obstacles out of their way so they can just do their job. And I look at the excessive hindgut or the things that I've talked to you about today that look like excessive hindgut fermentation and suggest the rumen isn't working right or the small intestine isn't working right. I look at those as obstacles, and our job is to get them out of her way.
Good answer. Got a good one here from Steve. It says, so your call out of Dr. Locke made me wonder if this recent high level feeding of high oleic roasted soybeans, should we change any of our expectations on manure consistency?
I don't know. I mean, one
It's
of
pretty
the
new.
yeah, one of the things with roasted soybeans, and hadn't thought about this before, typically with roasted soybeans, we don't grind them very finely. I mean, we're bringing down the particle size, but they're still on the chunky side. I mean, depending how finely you process them. And if you do that, think about this. You're protecting the rumen from a lot of free oils. You're also getting those fats, those lipids to the small intestine where they can be used as such. Um, but if the whole portion of that soybean that contains that oil is gradually being digested as it goes down the gut, does that leave things open to more oil actually getting all the way to the large intestine? And I don't know. I mean, we've gone after total tract fiber digestibility. We've looked at total tract starch digestibility. I wonder if anybody's looked at total tract oil digestibility. That would go back and play with your question.
Yeah. Interesting. Got a one here from a gentleman Met. Do you have any experience with grazing herds, or the things that we should look out for are different from housed herds?
With grazing with grazing herds, especially, I mean, there's a difference between loose manure from grazing and loose manure from a TMR that is not right. Okay. I mean, with the amount of protein, with the amount of water that's going through those animals, especially on spring pastures, loose is normal. Um, I was in New Zealand in early spring and was pawing through manure in a Jersey herd that was out on pasture. And it was interesting to me. You could see the only particles I could see were like the veins that were in the grass coming through, and the manure was kind of slimy. And I looked at this and I was like, okay, rate of passage, it's coming through quick. Is this sliminess mostly microbes? Which says things are working, but I'm not sure. I have not looked for things that would get at manure composition, and more of the manure variability on pasture. I have seen in a pastured herd where they were feeding enough concentrate back at the milking barn that I was getting concerned for what the manure was looking like out on pasture and for what was coming through. Um, I would think you could take the basic principles that I talked through in this and go out and look at grazing herds, but just recognize changing by portion of the year as well for what the manure will look like on pasture. That there are some other things that are going to vary by time of the year, time of the growing season, that can affect what you're seeing.
All right. We have so many great questions. You're also getting a big shout out from Dr. Jones. So he appreciates the summary and congrats on your new endeavor. Um, Next one comes in from Colin. Would analyzing manure tell us anything?
Okay. I mean, analyzing manure, they've been doing it for looking at starch digestibility. Um, I offer that probably manure varies somewhat across the day, and I did notice a question in there that asked, was there an ideal time to look at it? And I'd say mostly when you're there. Um, Gets you away from your computer and gets you out amongst the cows, which is another benefit of looking at manure. But looking at manure for starch is something that's been more commonly done, um, and can give an idea of what is getting past the rumen and the small intestine, and might send you back to looking at how you end up processing the grain that you're feeding that's bringing starch with it. Now, okay, an added benefit to, as I say, getting away from in front of your computer. Again, this is manure. It's not rocket science. Farmers can look at the manure and look at how it changes with their animals. Nutritionists, veterinarians, the folks who are servicing the farm, the herd manager can look at the manure and use it to get into a conversation. And that, I mean, with the cows always being right, they're interpreting the cow and figuring out how to work with her, and all of them can be involved in the conversation with something they can see every day. And I see that as another benefit to doing this sort of thing.
All right. Very well. Uh, Will is asking, what different things would you see in feces to differentiate rumen acidosis from excessive hindgut fermentation?
I don't think you can. Um, One of the things you notice about the gut is it's all interconnected. Okay. I mean, if you're trying to, when I was first looking at manure and walking herds and checking out rumination, and my basic baseline is 40 to 50% of any animals that are in sleeping, eating, drinking, or in heat should be ruminating. Okay. Um, what I end up doing is looking from one end of the cow to the other and figuring if something's off kilter with the rumen, it's gonna erupt to everything else that happens in the rest of the gut, okay? And so, looking at the particle size and looking at the feces and looking at the rumination, that's one benchmark to give you an idea that the rumen isn't functioning the way it was supposed to. Um, I am against ruminocentesis. I hope that's gone out of vogue. I have seen ruminal pHs down into the fives in cattle that are healthy and productive. Um, and this is looking at with ruminally cannulated cows. And I actually had a veterinarian ask me once, so if the ruminocentesis comes out and it doesn't look bad, does that mean we don't have a problem? I I guess I'm looking at the cow observations and looking at the manure and looking at everything in context as a non-invasive way for getting at rumen function, not just rumen acidosis, but rumen function that will affect the animal's health and overall performance, and you're better off with that. Um, so I wouldn't look at it just as ruminal acidosis, though you can use all the rest of this to buttress your case that that might be where you're creating a problem.
All right. I see that you're following along with the questions. Are there any that you've seen that we should answer that I haven't asked? 'Cause there's a bunch of them here still. That's another thing. We're past the top of the hour. Can you hang on just a bit longer?
I'd be glad to.
All right. Uh, so my first question, any there that you'd love to answer that I haven't asked yet?
Let's see.
I saw one from, I think the gentleman's name was Dan. I'm looking for it about a decision tree. Is there a decision tree that you would follow?
A decision tree that okay, this you know, kind of what
No,
let me give you something else here instead of a decision tree. And
that was actually
might,
Colin.
yeah, it might explain my research as well. Um, if you look at everything we just covered and the number of different things that I said to look at, it's more like throwing out a net and you start tugging on the knot and seeing what else moves. You see how it covers the entire ground and then see if it looks like a place where the net needs repair. And I kinda did the same thing with my research. It's throwing out a net and seeing if I pull on this, what happens over here? It it's kind of a yeah, overused word, holistic system for cows because one of the hazards of looking at manure is it can become a treasure hunt, okay? Um, you can get looking for things that are interesting. And actually, dairy farms I worked with typically found out that if I found something interesting, it wasn't probably good for them. Um, you need to take a balanced view. I mean, you integrate everything you can't, or I haven't been able to focus on just one thing and say, this is the answer. You hone it down to where you need to be.
Great answer. Actually, Dan, I'll go back to his. He was asking, can localized floor licking and manure water drinking in a small subgroup of cows indicate early SARA, or are there primarily environmentally triggered behaviors? In this case, would buffer or salt blocks be an appropriate first intervention before ration changes?
Tell you what, once upon a time, going visiting a farm in California with a friend, I was watching cows drink out of this manure water, and I was like, "What the heck?" Um, I and my colleague who was a veterinarian didn't know quite what was going on with them either. I guess when we see animals doing weird things and they're doing them consistently. I mean, throwing a salt block out there, so long as it doesn't create problems with trying to clean out the feed bunk, it's cheap and it can be indicative of what's going on. If you do that and drinking that foul water goes by the wayside, call it good. Um, it's sort of like when cows start eating bicarb or devouring salt or eating dirt. Something's wrong. And any of those things, we've typically said it was non-specific, something going on in the rumen or in the gut. Um, I'd wonder if this is the same, but I do not know.
All right, very well. Uh, Dr. Jones has a question. Can you reconcile the Minor Institute research on ration particle size versus what gets to the rumen? As I think they find that all rations get to the same particle size after chewing. Thinking rate of passage versus ration particle size.
One of the things that the folks at Minor tried to work on, and Mike Allen, Dr. Mike Allen of Michigan State tried to work on, was forage fragility. I mean, how quickly does a feed particle break up so that the microbes can digest it better and so that it breaks down so it can pass? I mean, I don't think we have that nailed. I mean, the fragility is gonna get to the question of how long does it take for a particle to get small enough to pass? And so another story. Once upon a time in Georgia, um, I had been asked to go to this farm because the nutritional consultant was concerned because the farmer didn't wanna buy any more forage, and he saw problems in the herd. So I'm walking the herd with him, and loose manure. I mean, it not good until we got to the dry cow pen, which had one of these very bulky, fiber-rich diets. I mean, it had enough groceries in there to meet the cow's needs, but it was also a very bulky diet. Lot of coarse fiber in it. Last pen we visited was the fresh pen, and the cows were there for week, 2 weeks, and the manure I saw there ranged from looking like dry cow manure to looking like good lactating cow manure to being just as bad as the rest of the herd was, loose and ugly. And I'm thinking they were feeding wheat straw in the dry cow diet. And discussions with Dr. Gabriela Varga, Penn State, we went back and forth, and it's like, okay, that fiber doesn't get reduced to nothing immediately. And so it's how long the fiber from the dry cow diet was still remaining functionally active, big enough particle size to be chewed and all, and affect the rumen mat, changed when things went from dry cow manure to good dairy cow manure to bad dairy cow manure on this herd once they were switched to the herd diet. So, in trying to reconcile, we have some pieces that we don't have yet. We have some things that would be great to measure that we don't have yet. So to reconcile particle size that we feed, first things first, keep them from sorting, but have it long enough so that they have to chew, and then understanding that that fragility of that particle that's gonna affect how the cow chewing affects it and breaks it down is the next piece we need to know what we need to do to keep the rumen healthy. I mean, how long is the fiber gonna be effective once she eats it, or does it get broken down really quickly? Like alfalfa versus grass. Alfalfa comes down to nothing because the leaves just pulverize, whereas grass, it's the whole piece that really needs to be chewed. I mean, both stem and leaf. Um, you ask a really good question, and I think there are some other pieces that we need to add to it to know what to do with it.
Hmm. Sounds like you need to come out of retirement, Mary Beth.
I'm only alleged. Only allegedly retired.
All right. Victoria is asking, what's your view on sieve with 2 or 3 grids versus the kitchen sieve for manure evaluation?
I can go to the grocery store and get a sieve. No, the several sieve system that's out there, and it was really kind of funny because that came out at the same about the same time that I was working with the kitchen sieve. And actually, my original sieve was a window screen that had a hole in it from our house, and I had it outside with a hose, and I had to yell at our and I'm going in to get something from the house, and we had a black lab named Jake, and I had dumped the manure out on the screen, and the next thing I hear is my husband saying, "No, Jake, no." Any rate, part of my manure sample was disappearing apparently. But what, um, what I think the 3 sieve system does is it lets you take a look at different particle sizes for what's coming through. With the single sieve, you're looking at it and trying to get a handle at just as you see it in detecting what do we have here. I mean, so the one might let you get into more detail. Um, I for myself and for how I work with this, I haven't I've been able to work well enough with the single sieve, but that personal preference and what are you looking for? So
We're about 15 minutes over, and we've still got more questions to go. But here's one, and I'll end with one question. But here's what I'm thinking, Mary Beth. I've been challenging my team to do a podcast with a live audience. This may be the one to try to do it with. There's so many good questions. Invite people on to come have a drink with us as we do, and ask questions of the fabled Dr. Mary Beth. Cheers. So we're going to end our time together here today with a question from Jorge. An opportunity to evaluate the health or ration quality of cattle through the analysis of recognizable volatile components or smell in the manure. Thought that was an interesting one to end on.
so the question is, okay, well, I tell you what, okay, we left the scratch and sniff tests off of the discussion on manure evaluation. You know, when I walk into there was this one barn I walked into, and the manure looked horrible. It was thin, it was pale, and it smelled off kilter sweet.
Hmm.
Okay, and turned out there was a bunch of metritis going through the herd. You walk into herds, and I mean, sometimes it's discerning what is the smell of the manure per se versus the ammonia that's permeating the place. I mean, there are other things that you can look to that help expand your questions. Okay? Not that you know exactly what's going on, but you say this is not what I'm used to experiencing and can get you to look further. Now you may not be able to find an answer on it, but you look for things that aren't the usual and then decide are they important to the cow? Because that's the only one that counts. Um, or are we okay? And you monitor it over time.
All right. Well, thank you, Mary Beth. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions, please submit them to marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science Lecture Series continues with educational topics each and every month, including our next few. On February 3rd, we welcome Dr. Jackie Borman from Purdue University to share the impact of muscle depletion and accretion across lactation. And on February 17th, we'll be back with Walt Cooley on the Real Producer Exchange as we take a deep dive into Skylar Garrick's farming operation in Arizona. Visit www.balchem.com/real science for details on future webinars and to register for upcoming events. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform and search for Real Science Exchange or visit balchem.com/podcast. And if you want a really cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt, just subscribe to the Real Science Exchange. Send us a screenshot along with your address and shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'll get that off to you right away. And on behalf of Balchem and Dr. Hall, Thank you for joining us today.